All right, here we go, everyone. Another awesome episode of the All Around Adventure podcast, and I'm excited to be talking with former Special Forces soldier and archaeologist Klint Janulis. Klint, what's going on, brother? Thanks so much for taking time for joining me today, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for having me. It's a rainy, gray day in rural England, and I'm sitting in my living room in my cottage. So,
well, nice and cozy. You know, that's one of the things that I guess I wouldn't say I entirely disliked about England, but I just couldn't help but notice that it is almost cloudy there all the time. And when you actually do have a sunny day, that's when everyone's going to be at the park and it's going to be crowded out in town because everyone wants to enjoy the sunshine. So, but for the most part, though, yeah, it's just dark and gray.
Absolutely. And I suspect with your when you did your master's, you were probably so busy to even notice the weather the first few months at first. But yeah, it starts setting in after about 9 months, a year, and you're like, oh God,
yeah,
this place can be pretty grim.
Well, and then not to mention that the sun sets so quickly there, because typically I use the sun going down as a cue that I should probably start wrapping up my studies. I'll be in the library at York. That's where I went to grad school. And then the sun will be setting and I start packing up thinking it's time to go home. And it's only like 4:30 in the afternoon. I'm like, what is going on here?
Yeah, that was a really hard adjustment. And I've been here, I guess, 7 years now. So, midwinter, you're just, you don't see the sun, but 4 hours a day. I mean, you don't even see daylight, but 4 hours a day, you rarely see the sun in its entirety in the winter here. So,
yeah,
and I think it's probably worse up near York, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd say so. I remember we only had snow one time when I was up there. And for the most part, though, being from Michigan myself, I could pretty much handle cold weather just as well. But it's just, yeah, what really got to me, though, man, was just like those, quick days that just went on by and, not having a whole lot of sunlight. And I can see why Dracula was drawn to England, in the novel. So that's a joke I always make.
No, it's a good one. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, probably more appropriate for his physical condition. No sun to worry about most of the time. Yeah, it's kind of ahead. I mean, I'm from Kansas, but we have cold winters, and if you've got snow, it's okay. You can handle it. Something to do. Also, you can go out and play. And you get a snow day. Here, I've seen snow a handful of times, and the rest of the time, usually it's like 40 degrees and raining. Just starting in October and ending in. Sometimes it doesn't end. There was one year here where we really didn't have a summer. It just rained the entire summer. It was like 58 degrees every day.
Oh, yeah. So, but yeah, as you mentioned, though, you've been living there for about a good 7 years now, but your story goes much more in depth than that. So I actually want to go back to the beginning, because every great story has a beginning. And actually, you and I, we're kind of cut from the same cloth, is that, we're both Marines, and then we both went on to pursue archaeology with, a little bit of excitement in between, and we'll certainly get to that. But let's go back to your time in the Marine Corps. It's a pretty big decision to join the military. And I would almost say that it's a even bigger decision to join the Marine Corps because of their reputation. So talk to us a little bit about what set you down that path. What led you to choose the Marine Corps?
Failure, mostly failure. I was a good wrestler in high school. I also played football, and I was nationally ranked and going into the state finals. I built my whole identity around being a good wrestler. It was sort of my thing because I wasn't a great student, and I'd been kind of a dorky farm kid. But when I got good at wrestling, it was something that people respected me for, and so I go into the state finals my senior year, and I kind of biff it. I should have taken first and then moved on to nationals, but I took fifth. And I felt like purposeless. So I just had nothing. I'd lost the thing that I'd built a lot of my self-esteem around. And a friend of mine joined the Marine Reserves, and he had signed up for it, and he told me, and I was like, oh, okay, I think I'll do that. So I signed up for the Marine Reserves, and I did go to college. I played football for a year and promptly failed out of that. So another failure. I just didn't go to class much. I did lift a lot of weights and work out because I was a redshirt freshman, but I didn't bother with class, and basically it was completely failed out. Did boot camp in the reserves, and tried another term at the kind of not a great university I was at. And after that, I said, well, all right, active duty. So I went active duty Marines. And it was just a way to, I worked 6 months sort of doing every job you can imagine. I worked with a migrant labor crew for 4 or 5 months, traveling around Oklahoma and Texas, building dairy barns. And I just had no purpose. And the Marine Corps offered a sense of meaning and some sense of pride. And, the Marine, very well, the Marine Corps instills that sense of pride, esprit de corps, purpose. And being a reservist wasn't really doing it for me. I needed this sort of structure in my life, and building dairy barn foundations in Boyce, Oklahoma was not doing it for me. So I went active duty, and then I enjoyed that time I had, but I didn't really care for my job. And 9/11 happened. I remember it very distinctly. And I remember feeling very useless, because in the job I was in, we weren't ever going to find ourselves in Afghanistan. And then I talked to a friend who was in recon, and he said that, after we did the invasion of Afghanistan, the recon guys weren't getting in on much. And another fellow said, well, he was switching to the Army to go SF because they were getting all the action at that time. And also the SF training program is, you get a lot more skills beyond just the commando skills. And a lot of those are transferable to college credits, such as language. You go through language school, such as paramedic. You go through paramedic course, and then maybe more advanced courses beyond that. And you get a number of other skills that you don't typically get in a lot of sort of infantry or commando units. So that seemed to me, well, you know what? I can meet this need I have. I don't know where it came from, to go prove myself after failing and failing and failing, and do something interesting, and also maybe rebuild a path back to university or college. And so I switched over to the Army, spent a year or so in the artillery before I could get to selection. And during that year, I got sent to Iraq to be on a weapons of mass destruction search team. So we were one of 4 sensitive site exploitation teams, wearing big hazmat suits made of Tyvek, and we had little chemical detectors. And so we'd clear buildings with a Cana detector and a rifle, and then atropine taped to your leg, looking for all these places where they might have been hiding the WMDs. And that was actually a really interesting job, because we were moving with the advancing frontline forces to get to these facilities before they could be abandoned or looted. And so and a lot of times we were the first people to see these parts of Iraq from the West in a long, long time. And it was a very fascinating experience. And then immediately afterwards, got home, went to selection, got selected, and went in through the Q course, which took almost 3 years.
Wow. No, that's quite the journey in the military, for sure. But so you mentioned that you were a wrestler. So, wrestling is, a pretty daunting sport. I didn't do it myself, but I was an MMA fighter. And, it's one thing to lift weights in the gym in a controlled environment, but it's an entirely different thing where you're trying to move another human being who has the ability to react and move himself. But kind of having maybe that background in wrestling and just having both the physical and the mental toughness that comes with that sport, did you find that maybe served you really well with dealing with the challenges of boot camp in the Marine Corps and ultimately moving on to selection in the Army? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't articulate enough how valuable that wrestling experience was in high school. I mean, just like MMA, any of these real combative martial arts, you have to practice and you have to do pressure tested sort of sparring events regularly, meaning you go to tournaments and matches, and during season 2-3 times a week, you're cutting weight, you're always running and lifting, and you're always having to push yourself. So it actually can be very masochistically miserable. And there were points in high school where despite being good, I just didn't want to do it anymore. I wanted to quit, and not quit because I didn't feel like I was a good wrestler. Quit just because 4 months out of the year, your life is just that's it. That's your life.
Right.
Watching every calorie you eat, constantly exercising, constantly training. But through all that, and if you really apply yourself, it leaves you with a set of mental and physical skills that are really transportable to a wide range of things, not just the martial arts, but even performative arts. Yeah, and so you get the mental toughness, and you get that physical ability of knowing how to manipulate your body and the kinetic energy of others, their bodies. So I think that was one of the most pivotal things in my ability to successfully get into the special forces, clearly,
Right.
in my mind.
Nice. So I'm not sure how much you could talk about this, but what did Special Forces selection actually entail? You mentioned that this is a very long, drawn-out training process, and and I think to some degree, the Special Forces is a little bit of a mystery. I don't see a lot about like Special Forces selection in like TV shows or movies or video games. It seems like the SEALs are often most showcased in like the realms of like pop culture and things like that. So what did kind of Special Forces training entail, if you're permitted to talk about those?
Yeah, and selection's roughly a month, and they're always kind of changing and tweaking it, mostly because they don't want people to be able to game it. They don't want one guy to get through and then tell his buddy the next year how to cheat the system, etc. But a lot of it was, you had your normal physical punishment, physical tests of strength and willpower. Mostly, it's not really not even about strength. And in fact, I remember in my selection class, there was a number of guys who'd come over from the SEALs and the Ranger Battalion, and these guys were jacked. You sit there, you show up at selection, 300-400 dudes. There's no rank, no names. You just you get a number on your camis, and it's like it's a big ass sniffing contest, if you can imagine. Every wannabe tough guy in the military is there trying to get in, and so you're all like huddled in these shacks out at Camp McCall outside Fort Bragg, and you see some of these guys. I saw some of these guys. I'd seen them coming in, when you're in processing, so you kind of know who some of these people are. And it was a couple guys. One of them had a trident tattoo on his bicep, so he was clearly hopefully a SEAL. And but he was clear. It's like the most jacked human being I'd ever seen. And I'd been in a football program where in Western Kansas, where a lot of the guys were using horse steroids. And this guy
man.
His six pack looked like bricks, just like. And there were a few other guys like that. There was a small group of guys that had come from Ranger Bat, and they'd been training together, and they were all very fit, but a lot of them had a high level of muscle mass and no body fat, and had not really worked as much on the cardio as they had on their strength conditioning. And so what you started seeing throughout selection over that month is a lot of the activities, such as you wear you call it your tick, your backpack, your rucksack. You call it a tick because it sucks the life out of you. And when you add 60 to 80 pounds, you magnify the amount of calories you burn. And the military actually uses an equation called the Pandolf Equation to calculate fairly precisely how many calories you're going to burn, given somebody's body weight, the type of terrain, the speed, the distance, and the amount of weight they're carrying. Some of these guys got knocked out, not because they were weak, but they started getting kidney failure. They started going into rhabdomyolysis and cannibalizing their own muscle, because you're needing so many calories. For some of these, a big part of the selection is what they call a STAR course, this extreme land navigation course, where you may move 25 miles to get to a point, and when you get there, you're in the middle of nowhere in the forest. There's like an old man hiding under a canopy, and he's like, "Well done, recruit," or "Well done, candidate," and he hands you a number. It's a grid coordinate, and he's like, "That's your next one, go." And you may have been on the move for 2 days, totally by yourself, and you sit and you don't have GPS or anything. You just have a map, protractor, compass, and a little small red lens flashlight, just enough to look at the map, but not enough to navigate through the forest at night. Right? And so you sit and plot your next point, and you're like, oh shit, that's 20 more miles. Oh, and you're just like, oh God, okay. And so you head out and you do it and you get to your next one and you get a point and you're like, oh, that's only 4 miles. Okay. And then you plot it and you're like, oh my God, it's going through a draw that's got like 600, 700 foot of relief. And you in North Carolina, that means, you know, for sure what that means. It's going to be what we call the draw monster. Just bramble and thick, nasty things that grab you. And so that 4 miles may be 10 times as hard as the 10-mile trek that goes through a, you know, high elevation part of the forest. And I remember very distinctly, at first I really wasn't very successful. I was just trying to go direct line of sight, you know, as a crow flies between points. And I went right through the draw monster, and I got so hung up by bramble that I fell down, and I was above the ground about 2 foot, just hanging there. My rucksack's all banged up against my head, and my rubber duck rifle's over here. And I'm like, oh God. And then I was like, well, screw it. I fell asleep, or I must have, because I just remember waking up and hearing this shuffling sound, and I was like, what the hell is going on? I couldn't see. And below me, I could hear this noise in the leaves, and it's a turtle. He was just crawling through the leaves under me, and I looked at him, and I kind of watched him walk off, and I was like, oh my God, what am I doing? But I learned the hard way. I mean, and you know, the straightest path is not always the best path. So on situations like that, you look for the best terrain. It may add a couple miles, but it'll be half the time and half the energy. So, and that's roughly it. You do this series of land navigation courses, which are actually really interesting, because land navigation in complex terrain requires a lot of brain power, and it's a really good selection mechanism. And in fact, most spec ops units use some sort of intense land navigation as part of their selection process. And then the last part of it usually is something where you're working with a team, like an A-team, 12-man small group, and you undergo this really grueling week-long thing where you really don't sleep, you really don't eat, you just have to keep pushing yourselves, and you're given these different missions where each person takes a role planning it, and that forces you to push yourself. It also forces you to get along with 11 other humans, that everybody's stressed, everybody's hungry, everybody's tired. And so you rate each other anonymously, like 1 out of 12 or whatever, every day. And so they use that to see what sort of personality. They may be tough physically, but you know, when they get stressed, they impose that stress on others. They take their stress and they turn it into group stress, which is really toxic. I mean, it's really toxic in combat. So it doesn't matter how tough you are. You can be freaking Superman. But if you're the sort of person that gets stressed out and you make everybody around you more stressed, then you're not really fit for that type of a job. And so it's through that process they sort of weed out some of the personalities that belong to people who may be very physically and mentally competent, but they don't handle the stress in a way that's really ideal for small unit guerrilla warfare activities.
Right. Yeah.
High stress, high danger conditions.
Right. So it's kind of more or less a character assessment more than anything else, because also going along with the character, you know, if you got the mental fortitude to break through, you know, you were describing these, you know, other individuals who were just, you know, jacked beyond belief, but maybe they didn't have it quite up here to make it towards the end. Because especially when it comes to things like aesthetics, as you're describing, you know, this guy with like the bricklayer abs and stuff like that, I guess, you know, it's like in the end, you know, the enemy's not going to care what you look like under your body armor, right? You know, he cares how long you can persevere and how long and how well you can fight. So,
yeah, and that brings up a good point. It's the U.S. Army Special Forces. They call themselves the quiet professionals. So usually you do not hear, particularly people who are still out. You don't hear a lot of SF guys out tooting their own horns on that, because there's sort of an ingrained. Not inbred, but embedded culture about keeping things quiet. You know, information's power, and the more other people know, you never know how much you're giving away that may be used against you later. And then on that, they also have the notion called the gray man. Be the gray man wherever you go. If you look like frickin' Thor and you're working in Africa, then everybody's going to notice the jacked looking Thor dude with the ballistic Oakley sunglasses over there, you know? And so what you'll see, you'll notice maybe a difference. A lot of the SF guys tend to be, they don't look like super, you know, Marvel superheroes. They look more like the quiet guy you don't really know much about. And that's kind of intentional. And each group, SF is broken up into groups. Each group has a regional specialty. They have their own subculture, so it may be different. It's different from group to group. I was in 10th group in Colorado. We did a lot of alpine stuff. So a lot of the people in that group were sort of very alpine-oriented sports enthusiasts, and that doesn't generate jacked people. It generates sort of lean muscle, endurance type physiques. And those are, you know, for some types of operations, that's what you want. Now, if you're just doing direct action, kicking indoors all day, and that's what you do, then having extra mass is a helpful thing. Absolutely. You need to be able to physically control any object or organism you encounter. And so having extra muscle and mass can be a great asset in units that primarily focus on direct action.
Gotcha. Okay. So now kind of jumping ahead a little bit, you know, obviously you made it through this long, intensive selection process because you ultimately did become a special forces operator. So where did this lead you in your career? Like, what are some places around the world that you've gotten to deploy to, and, you know, where have you been called to serve?
I got out just in time for Iraq to really start heating up again. And while Iraq was not my, you know, I went to French language school in the special forces training. I never met a single person in Iraq who spoke French. So I did 2 more combat tours in Iraq. One was during the surge in 2007, and it was ugly during that time period. So it was, SF teams were just pushed to the max. It didn't matter where their regional specialties were. They were getting pulled into Afghanistan and Iraq, and being part of this really big push during the surge to kind of, you know, it was an all or nothing sort of mindset at that time. We're going to put as much as we can into one push and try and get Al-Qaeda out of Baghdad and Bakuba and drive them out. And then when I refer to them, I'm referring primarily to foreign Al-Qaeda who'd come in, taken advantage of the chaos that was left behind after we sort of disbanded the entire government and military in one day, and had become embedded. And this surge was meant to push them out. So there was 100,000 plus soldiers, if I remember correctly, sent in, and all the SF teams were given very regional areas with kind of basically general guidelines as to how to proceed and try and drive these guys out. And so that tour was interesting. It was the area we worked in, the one road in and out looked like the crater of the moon, surface of the moon with craters. Wow. And so, but part of that also was interesting was we went in as problem solvers. We weren't just door kickers. So to solve the problems and figure out why people were working with Al-Qaeda and other groups, we needed to know what was going on economically and culturally. So we got to know the tribal system there. We got to know the political leadership. And actually there were several tribes there who had actually traditionally gotten along with each other despite having mixed Sunni Shiites in a couple of them. And this sectarian conflict between the Shiites and the Sunnis and different branches of Sunni fundamentalist groups was really complex. And that breaking that down and understanding that and the economics behind it really got me interested in anthropology.
Gotcha. Okay. So now being exposed to a culture like this, you know, obviously you were talking about, you know, that's part of what you do in special forces is, you know, integrating with the culture on the ground, trying to figure out how to best, you know, I guess, serve them and what problems to address and things like that. But, you know, you're noticing like a different economic level. You know, you might have been exposed to poverty, and obviously this is a culture that's been immersed in violence for a very long time. What was it like coming back to the U.S. following an experience like this and kind of just seeing like the contrast? Was that maybe like a difficult adjustment, basically? Because, you know, let's face it, in the U.S. sometimes we have a lot of first world problems, right? So what was that kind of like for you, having that new perspective after being exposed to that?
Well, it was interesting in a couple ways. I'm from a very rural community in Kansas, and I grew up on a farm. And most of the people we worked with, we were out kind of near the eastern side of Iraq, and very agricultural focused region, very rural. Almost everybody was farmers or tradesmen of some sort. And it was coming back home. It was hard to not suddenly see the similarities in terms of how people were living their lives. And so, forgetting the violence, you could see how small tensions in a rural Kansas farm town, or these small cultural details and differences, could really get magnified in any small community like that if you put and apply enough pressure, stress, and violence. You could really see almost any community end up in the same scenario we saw in Iraq, particularly when people can't feed their kids and they are under constant threat, existential threat to their life by outsiders and people turning on each other. And, take the petty squabbles you see in rural America, magnify that times 10. And it actually kind of makes this it gave me this sort of universal, like, oh, wow, we're all, so there's a universality to how we react to stress, to these pressures, to things that threaten our family and our way of life. And so instead of seeing differences, I started seeing similarities.
Gotcha. Okay. So also kind of going along with that, you mentioned a lot of like the stresses involved with things like that. So how did you kind of find you were able to kind of balance your life as a soldier, and you're also a husband, and you got other obligations in your life as well. You have your family back home in Kansas, and just obviously for yourself too. Making sure your health is in check and things like that to perform well at your job. So how did you kind of strike a balance with all these obligations that you had to fulfill while you were in the special forces?
I don't know that I don't know that I still struck a balance. Maybe worse. One thing, when I was at least in Iraq, I turned to the anthropology side of what we're doing. Got me interested in just general anthropology, but also I'd always been interested in the natural sciences. And right around then, Amazon started delivering the APO addresses.
Really?
And so and I had
nice.
some friends who were in the SF course, the Q course, some roommates who were educated. They were guys who'd gone to like good universities and decided to become enlisted special forces just for the experience. And they kind of introduced me to certain books on philosophy and science that really got me interested and engaged back with learning and academia. And really, I learned how to learn in the SF course. I never knew how to study before. I didn't have to. And to pass the SF medic course, which is really a academically brutal course.
I bet.
Maybe the most, people said it's the highest failure rate of any academic course in the military.
Oh.
I had to learn how to study, and it was sink or swim. And I was just damn fortunate. I had a couple of roommates who'd gone through really good universities, and they taught me how to take notes and how to study and retain information and then apply it to complex analytical reasoning. And then I wouldn't have gotten that outside of that context. And so then when I was in Iraq and looking for ways to keep myself entertained, I just started ordering all these books on natural science and anthropology, and I ended up getting into entomology, E.O. Wilson and Bert Holdobler, these guys who study social insects. And I was reading these books about social insects and how they behave instinctively, and then seeing these patterns between how the humans I was working with were behaving culturally. I mean, there was these overlapping similarities between how ants will forage and make decisions as a group, and also how complex political organizations do it. And so I retreated into learning when I didn't really get into video games and everybody go play Xbox or whatever. So I was the dork that was sitting in my chew in my hut reading a book on social insects. And then that's how I kept myself mentally engaged. And physically, my wife was going back to school. Fortunately, SF, we had phones, we had internet. I was able to communicate with her while she was going through law school fairly regularly. And we learned as a couple how to deal with that stress together. And that's, we've been married almost 15 years, and it was a hard experience, but it really kind of taught us to be a team, my wife Amanda and I. And yeah, so that's handling it. Is I watch everybody handle it differently. Some guys turn to drink, some guys turn to anger and resentment, and some guys try and channel it into something, whether it's productive or not. It could be video games, it could be just a hobby, or it could be reading dorky books about social insects.
It's interesting how you mention social insects like that. I remember when I was in the Gambia for my Peace Corps service, and I went to one of the wildlife reserves there, and I just saw these massive ants. I'm not sure exactly what species of ant they were, but they were just moving in this straight line from a hole in one side of the ground to like across like this walkway path to a hole on the other side of the ground. And obviously when you see ants moves, it looks like just this chaotic mess. I think that's why a lot of people are afraid of them when they see them. But then when you just like actually just stop and take a look, I'm like, okay, there's a flow here. There's a pattern, like somehow there's synergy amongst all of these tiny little creatures. And I don't know, you just made me think of that moment all of a sudden. I was just kind of fascinated because I guess I have my dorky tendencies as well.
Yeah, clearly we were probably the dorks in our platoons or whatever. But you're right that the army ants in Africa are, I just suspect it's what you were seeing, are fascinating because they go on the march and they're very organized, like an infantry platoon or company going out on an operation. And what's weird is they have, if they're all of the same colony, they're all genetically identical, and they're all female, unless it just happens to be the mating season when males are produced just long enough to go mate and die. But they have a hierarchy, and some of these army ant species have 4 different types of shape, so morphology they call it. But despite the fact that they are all sisters, genetically identical, whenever certain hormonal signals are transmitted throughout the colony, saying, okay, we need more soldiers. And it might be because a bunch of ants just died on a foraging expedition. So the hormones will trigger changes in the bodies of the newly pupating larvae. And so they will start producing more soldier ants. So basically a hormone triggers in the pupal stage. And when they come out, they are soldier ants, meaning they have these massive heads, massive mandibles, and just a few neurons, just enough neurons to follow the group and be protective. And then sometimes they need more nursery worker ants that sit down in the lower chambers and protect the eggs. And sometimes they need more foragers. And it's really strange when you think about it. It's like sending people to a different MOS school just because, shit, we had a bunch of infantry guys killed today. We need some more infantry, some more grunts. Right. Okay. You 20 recruits, you're all going to infantry school. Only they do it hormonally. We do it through culture.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, certainly wasn't anticipating talking about insects, but I think those were army ants that I had saw, especially when you're talking about the large heads and the big sharp mandibles. That's what they looked like. So maybe that's what I had seen after all. So yeah, now, go ahead.
Take your tactical mind, your Marine Corps mind, and go Google some. I think they're called. They might be called driver ants, depending on where. But go to YouTube or something and watch them as they move in formation, and you'll see they set up formations not too dissimilar from the way we do route protection convoy formations, and so they'll set up their protective flanking elements, the soldier ants in one area, and then they'll have the logistical weak points in the middle. And it's really interesting, and you can apply, basic tactics are universal when it comes to defensive and offensive strategies, whether it be ants or humans. So I think you might find it interesting as a former Marine and dork.
Oh yeah, for sure. So, you did mention, obviously with you diving into your studies like this, that you were maybe a little bit of an outlier in your unit, but still, like, no doubt, obviously very close ties to everyone, because, you're part of this, elite warrior class, and you're all like deployed in this harsh environment together. So what was it like when you actually had to transition out into civilian life, and ultimately having to leave this tribe of warriors that you are now a part of, and just trying to go and essentially just, hit the reset button and start over as civilian? What was that transition like for you?
Oh, I mean, it's a good question. I think the reset button really got hit when I came to England. So for a few years, I finished my undergraduate degree, and I had stayed in the National Guard Special Forces, right? And so
Okay.
I was on a team. Several of my team members were going to university. Most the National Guard SF guys were guys, at least ones I worked with, had come from active duty. And in Colorado, all of SF, you tend to get assigned to a group, and that's sort of your home base the rest of your career, because that's where your language skills are. That's where your legacy is, I guess. So
Gotcha.
a lot of my close friends were still in the area when we were in Colorado. And so that wasn't so bad. I could meet up with them anytime. My wife was friends with them and their spouses, and so we had a great community. And then when this whole England Oxford thing came up, that was the real reset button. I mean, we had this cool little mountain cabin halfway between Denver and Colorado Springs in this awesome little town, Palmer Lake. And we had to sell our house, sell basically everything, kept the dog, and came to England, and we had to start over. And so it's been rebuilding my European tribe, I guess you could say. But I still stay in touch with most of my colleagues and friends from the military. A number of whom are still getting near retirement now. They're all sergeant majors. Most of them are, and so I stay in touch with them. When I go home, I go to Colorado probably once a year. We get together, get drunk, talk about the good old days. And,
right. War stories.
Yeah, and a number of them have actually made it over here to Europe. And so I'll give them this sort of England Oxford tour, and then we'll go to the local pub, which is always fun, and do the same thing. We'll get drunk and reminisce. And then, so I've still got ties to that. And I'm still close to my friends back in rural Kansas, as well as my military friends. So it's not a total reset. I just don't have regular contact with them because I'm here. But I've got a number of friends I've made here both in England and academia at Oxford. I mean, that they bear the same qualities, and they're interesting, driven humans who've got inner mental toughness. Those tend to be the people aggregate to, and who just talk about different stuff instead of when you're going to get called up to go to whatever instructor course or whatever. We're talking about dork things.
Yeah, it definitely does take a certain drive to go through the realm of academia, for sure. Because having gone through the military and then and then recently just becoming a master, earning my master's degree. Yeah, it's just I'm not sure which one sucked more over the next. I mean, like 3 months of hell in boot camp, or all these years in the classroom and writing assignments and all that stuff. It's really kind of hard to distinguish which one sucked more in that case.
I agree. I'm just trying to finish up my last chapter of my PhD thesis, and it is hard to say, because particularly, and I know the master's programs particularly are quite intense, quite course heavy, quite testing heavy. And then I would just say, when you get into the PhD, they call it a DPhil at Oxford, but same thing. You're kind of on your own. I'm not in a laboratory. I don't work with a laboratory science group. So it's a lot of, you're not being driven by external pressures. It's on you. And you have to come up with 200-300 pages of novel, informative, interpretation and analysis of a particular topic that can be publishable. And yeah, it's a totally different game. At least on a team, I had teams starting like, hey, what the hell's a damn, we need the supply inventory for all your expensive med kit done by tomorrow so we can reorder stuff. And I'll be like, shit, okay, I'll stay up late and do it. Here it's like, well, good luck. We'll see you in a few years.
Yeah, just have at it, right?
I mean, you do get guidance, but it tapers off as you progress. And so I've done this thing where it's called a confirmation of status. So you've done like 2/3 of your writing and research. You present it to a number of professors and whatever, and you present the written material. It gets assessed, and from there you sort of get confirmed, like, all right, you're on the right track. Go ahead and finish this thing, and we'll see you in a couple of years. And that's where I'm at. I've already done that bit. Now I'm just trying to finish the last of it up. And it's a totally different game. It's kind of a head fuck in a different way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I loved selection. I actually have fond memories of the STAR course, that navigation course, being by myself, driven with a goal. The goal being get to this next point. It's 3 a.m. It's raining. You've been moving for 3 or 4 days, but you've got a goal and you know how to achieve that. But here, finish your last chapter. I've been saying this for like a year, like, oh, I'm almost there.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of correlations that I found with being in the military and the principles that and the character traits that you pick up in the military and how those can be applied to academia and also in archaeology, which is what you're pursuing. So like, what actually led you to pursue archaeology in the end? You mentioned a little bit about that. You got interested in the anthropology, while you're on your deployments, but what led you to hone in on archaeology and also specifically, paleoarchaeology? I guess because somehow I imagine that like, for someone who has a special forces background, maybe they'd be like a battlefield archaeologist or something like that. But, what kind of like led you to pursue this path now?
Good question. I had the good fortune at some point in my SF career to go to the SEER, what they call Primitive Skills Survival Instructor course.
Right.
So, at SEER, the Search, Evasion, Resistance, Escape, the survival school, there's a number of different skills that are taught there. And so one of those being primitive technology survival skills. So what do you do if you don't have a hatchet, a knife, et cetera, et cetera? And the course is quite intensive with a guy named John McPherson, who's old survival mountain man guy who's been teaching the U.S. Army SF SEER instructors for a couple decades. And you go live with him and you're up at 5:30 making fire, then you go to bed at 10, 11 at night, just learning every way to manipulate the natural world without modern tools that you can think of. And the idea, I wasn't at the schoolhouse. The idea was that I would put on refresher training for guys in my unit because it's a perishable skill. And so when I started taking paleoanthropology and archaeology courses, I realized that we were deriving our information about humans in the Stone Age from the technologies they had left behind. And other things like the faunal remains, the bones. We can see bones in caves or in archaeological sites that have cut marks on them, have been cooked, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And suddenly, in talking through these things with a couple of professors I had at the University of Colorado Springs, I could start seeing some of these patterns based off my hands-on experience with these technologies that a lot of archaeologists don't have. And so it really kind of drew me in, particularly when I started taking courses in cognition, how early humans were thinking. And so when you can think through the steps of a Stone Age human by one, knowing the materials that they were making, using, and how they were using them, and two, then knowing the neuroscience and the cognitive science, then that's kind of a powerful analytical tool to help be able to assess what the earliest humans were doing and why. And that got me really interested because it goes beyond paleoarchaeology. Now for my PhD, I'm applying it to paleoarchaeology, but there's other domains in which you can apply how our relationship with the tools and the world we live in shapes how we think about the world.
Yeah. And, there's an interesting, when you look back on that and just how, humans have lived way back then. And, it's just in this day and age, we have it pretty easy with the most part, with a lot of our comforts where, we have technology. You don't have to go out and hunt and kill your animals anymore. You just type in a few buttons on your phone and someone's bringing a ready-made meal to your door. And some people can't seem to, it may be a little bit crazy to them to think that, man, did people really live like that 10,000 years ago? How did they not all just die off because of the way things were? But the fact is, well, they found a way somehow. So, and this was kind of like the premise of, one of the productions that you did, 10,000 BC, where everyone was out there trying to live like the way someone would had 10,000 years ago, and they had to give up their smartphones and everything beforehand. But people were doing it. So it's kind of cool to look back on, paleoarchaeology and things like that, just to kind of think that, we're pretty tough, if we so want to, but maybe we kind of lost track of that with our modern day comforts a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, we've lost track of maybe that ability to manipulate the natural world and feed ourselves with, the organic and stone materials. And I think some people underestimate how complex the lives were of people 10, 20, 30,000 years ago, particularly in the Upper Paleolithic, because, everybody views the agricultural revolution 10, 12,000 years ago as being the changing point that creates human inegalitarian societies and food surplus, food storage. But actually, we find evidence of this at the time period in which the glaciers are at their maximum advance, the late glacial maximum, 28 to 38,000 years ago. We've got evidence of hunter-gatherers who had enough free time to make ornate tools and jewelry that have no practical purpose and bury them with a group of 3 humans. And then some experimental archaeologists estimate that the goods, some of these are beads, some of them like thousands of beadwork on a shirt, and ornate carved ivory spears that wouldn't, they're decorative, they wouldn't spear anything. This is from a burial site in Russia. So not only is it the glacial maximum, it's in Russia. And whatever they were doing, they had enough spare time as a group to devote 10,000 plus hours to non-practical, non-functional objects and bury them with 3 humans. If you're doing that, if you've got 10,000 hours, that's 10,000 hours you're not hunting, you're not gathering. That's 10,000 surplus hours. And so for me, I think of this in terms of an economic sense. That's, if you make $10 an hour, 10 times 10,000, economically speaking, or at least in their case, calorie-wise and time-wise, they were quite wealthy. And they were probably the recipients of someone else's labor, because 2 of those people were children. They didn't make 10,000 hours worth of carved goods.
Right.
So you've got some evidence for this, what they call inegalitarian societies, but you've got evidence that some people were benefiting from the labor of others, good or bad. I'm not assigning a judgment to it, but this society was so successful that they could afford that kind of a loss. Now, that kind of reframes, when you look at that deeply, to me, it reframes how society perceives everything being either Stone Age and then agriculture, and that's the split. And actually, I think it pushes the complexity of how we were living our lives back a lot further.
Oh, that's fascinating, man. Right on. So where has your tenure as an archaeologist taken you? What are some of the places that you got to travel to around the world, and where are some of the sites and settings that you've gotten to work on?
So some of the, let's start in the U.S., Colorado being a great one. It's where I did my first excavation. But then southern Spain, which is fantastic. It's good food, good weather, friendly people, everything's very cheap, amazing archaeology, and you got the ocean, mountains. And then southern Greece, I've worked in Bulgaria, I've worked in Mongolia, and Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, these are just some of the places I've been. And we tend to go to places where the climate lends itself to preserving the archaeology. That's why we're there. And they tend to be either very arid or very coastal, like southern Spain, warm, nice places to be. Now, Saudi Arabia may not be a top tier destination, vacation destination for most folks, but it's actually the Arabian Peninsula and the desert, the Nafud Desert we were working in. It's got stable sand dunes that have been there for hundreds of thousands of years. And boy, if something was left there 100,000 years ago, it's probably still where it was left if nobody's bothered it. And it's so sparsely populated, people don't bother. There's Bedouin herders out there, and they see piles of rocks and stone tools and bones, and that's just part of the landscape to them. They don't bother with them. And so there's some amazing archaeology there.
Yeah, I bet. So, like, what was it like going back to the Middle East in this capacity as an archaeologist? Because, probably I'd imagine, like, before this time in Saudi Arabia, you going to the Middle East was for an entirely different purpose. So, I guess, what was it like kind of doubling back to the Middle East in this capacity?
It was a bit intimidating at first. I was a bit, I'm not going with a bunch of operators. I was going with a bunch of archaeologists, most of whom don't know how to drive a car. They're Europeans, and so I was a bit, I kind of left information on where I was going to be, points of contact with a couple of my friends who were still in, just doubling down, making sure. But the Saudis are actually really have gotten a good security apparatus within their country, and we were escorted by sort of Secret Service, their version of the Secret Service. The archaeologists who were from Saudi Arabia were fantastic. They were very warm and inviting, and while we didn't go out in town much, that sort of thing, we didn't interact with a wide group of people outside of the archaeology and cultural resource department of the Saudi Royal Heritage Commission. It was a very fascinating experience, and I didn't ever feel unsafe or anything of that nature. And there's some really beautiful parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and they were also very warm and inviting people. So we went and did big meals with several different families. We went to a citrus orchard that was run by one of the archaeologists' family. They put on a big spread, goat and camel. We viewed their citrus groves, and it was cool. It was a great experience because they brought us into their homes and shared with us part of their lives. And this wasn't, this is outside the professional context of what we were doing. This was interacting with them, how they live. And it was that, they still had their old Bedouin tent with all the rugs and everything. And that's where we ate. And it was a great time. It was totally different experience, obviously. And I felt at first uncomfortable not having the means to defend myself.
Right.
Didn't have a weapon. But the Secret Service guys, they were very well briefed on who we all were. So they kind of knew my background, because you have to do a background security check and everything. And so they honestly came up to me and asked me a lot of questions. They wanted to know about this and that. And then at one point I was given the insurance and the permission basically to be able to drive their vehicles, because we kept getting stuck a lot, and it was very frustrating. So I was like, all right, why don't I pick the routes on a couple of these? And they're like, okay. Because some of these guys had grown up in the city. They weren't natural, like, off-roaders. And so I felt a greater sense of agency and control once I got behind the wheel of a vehicle again. And I was like, all right, we can do this. This is
nice.
Cool. And, if something happens, I'll just grab one of their guns.
Of course, definitely.
But it really wasn't a concern. A security concern was minimal. I felt completely safe the whole time.
Gotcha. Right on. So now, being both a veteran and an archaeologist, now I will say I don't come across a whole lot of archaeologists who have prior military experience. I mean, I have, but they're kind of few and far between, right? Now, if we have any veterans listening right now, would you recommend the path of an archaeologist to other veterans out there?
Absolutely. The military skill sets, almost regardless of MOS, are broadly applicable. So if you're somebody who liked, let's just say you were infantry or something in combat arms, if you like that aspect of the job, and let's say logistics, planning, assessing security situations, and all those sorts of little things that go along with it. Being in the military is a lot more than just knowing how to fire an artillery piece or fire a rifle or turn a wrench. It comes with a big package of planning skills that you learn. And if you enjoy working with your hands and applying that logistical knowledge and experience, archaeology is almost the perfect thing for some types of veterans, because you get to go to cool places, you get to work with your hands, but you still get to engage in that sort of logistics and planning and all stuff that I enjoy quite a lot. And a lot of military guys are really well suited for that type of work because they've got all those skills already, they just applying it to a different, you're not applying it to a security situation. You're applying it to the quest for information.
Yeah, or you and I, we kind of talked a little bit about this before, is that, veterans throughout a good part of their life, their mission was protecting our freedom, protecting our way of life. And archaeology gives them a chance to protect our cultural heritage just as well, too. So still very much being of service, but, obviously in a different capacity, with using their hands for a different way, for to achieve something different than, like you said, firing a rifle. But, it's interesting that you mentioned that. And I appreciate that answer, because you and I, we kind of talked a little bit about what I got coming up. I'm getting ready to do Operation Dual Trek, where I'm going to be walking the length of both Paraguay and Uruguay in June of this year. And that's to raise money for a nonprofit that actually takes, it's called American Veterans Archaeological Recovery. They take veterans out into the field to get them to experience archaeology. And, they kind of mentioned a lot of the correlations that you just described, is that, not only do they get to connect with, other veterans, but they get to apply like a lot of the skills that they use, because they're also used to, physical work, physical, taxing jobs, which sometimes archaeology, you're down there, you're in the excavation unit, you're getting dirty, it could be long days. But again, they're very well suited for that based on what they've done throughout their careers. So I appreciate that response, because there's a lot of correlation there for sure.
Yes, and you had mentioned the American Veterans Archaeological Recovery Program. I think that's a fantastic idea, and I'm happy to support this idea, because not all the things you just articulated, particularly, you served your country, protecting your country, now protect your heritage through preservation, but getting your hands dirty, working on tough days, but you also build camaraderie with the other archaeologists, even whether they're soldiers or not. You go through this sort of work, and tough living conditions, et cetera, together. You develop a bond with the group. It's very similar to the military, and it's a really good way to channel your energies when you get out of the military. If you're looking for a way to stay engaged professionally in something that you find enjoyable, but also takes advantage of your previous skills, I almost can't think of a better job that aside from security contractor. But if you want to get out of the arms, the martial disciplines or professions, I guess, archaeology is a great way to channel those skills and achieve some of those same things that a lot of people found so appealing about the military.
Yeah, awesome, man. Yeah, and that's definitely what I've experienced. And actually, tomorrow I'm going to be heading down to Big Cypress National Preserve down in South Florida, and this is going to involve me getting to ride in a helicopter to go to sites that are so remote, like way out in the middle of this swamp, that you can only really get to by helicopter, or it'll take you forever to get there by swamp buggy, because this entire preserve is about the size of the state of Rhode Island. So it's massive. So we got to take the helicopter. And then we're going to be going through the swamp, and I'm probably going to be up to my knees in water, which sounds uncomfortable. And it is, don't get me wrong. But there's something that's one of the most exciting parts about my job, is just being able to slug it out there in the wilderness, and it's just an absolute blast. And I can definitely see a lot of veterans really enjoying an aspect like that of the job for sure in archaeology.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. What are you guys surveying? What are you looking for?
We are going to be doing some site assessments. There's tons of Black Earth midden sites, probably Seminole or prehistoric in some way, that are just scattered throughout the entire preserve. And Hurricane Irma had blown through, a few years back. And so we're actually doing damage assessments, seeing if any of these sites might have been damaged by the storm, if they've uprooted any trees. And there's also been a couple of wildfires that have gone through the preserve. So we're going to see if maybe there might have been fire damage to any of these sites. So yeah, we're just getting a good sample, just going to some different ones, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And I'm leading this project. So
fantastic.
So that's also, exciting for me. So, and then once again, leadership qualities and characteristics that are built up in the military are being translated yet again. So it's good stuff. It's exciting.
That sounds like great fun. Do you guys, I assume sorry, my brain's now thinking logistics, because LZs in the swamp have got to be a fairly rare commodity.
Yeah, it is, and
Depending on
that's
what
gonna.
platform you're on.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of the logistical planning came into play as well. I spent a lot of time looking at satellite imagery, trying to get a feel of what the terrain looks like, and thinking to myself, okay, can we find a good LZ to put the helicopter that's still relatively close? Because obviously, coming from being safety minded as well, it's like it's not just me that's going into these sites. I'm leading another archaeologist in there as well, so I got to think about his safety. So yeah, a lot of that planning and mindset is coming to the forefront yet again. So, but it is tricky to find a good place to land the ship, and I've done this a couple of times now, and sometimes it takes getting to an actual site and just having to make the call. It's like, yep, I don't think we can safely land here. Let's just move on to the next one. So there's a lot at play for sure.
Yeah, that sounds really complex. Take photos? I'm sure you will, but you should post photos. I'm looking forward to seeing them on your social media. That sounds like a ton of fun, to be honest.
Oh yeah.
I would be in hog heaven, as it were. But yeah, that's funny. Yeah, it reminds me of an operation we did where we had done a satellite recce of what looked like a good LZ. We had at least 100 meters of clearance on either side, and one of the locals we'd spoken to said, "Yeah, this is a great place," and he didn't know which field we were referring to outside this village. We were supposed to pick up some humans, and it turned out to be kind of a rice paddy that was mostly 3 foot of water that was fertilized with nightshade. I believe they call it, which is human feces. So we're all rappelling down into waist-high muck, and the prop wash is just kicking shit up into, and it's covering everything, your night vision, and we started taking.
Oh man!
And we're all just like in this. It's like being in a vat of pudding or something, and we're all like trying to move, and the helicopter. And we still got guys coming off the bird, starts taking small arms fire. We're all just like covered in shit. All of our optics are done. It's middle of the night. You just smell, and you're like, oh God. And it was just absurd. I mean, fortunately, whoever was shooting was really inept, not very accurate. So, but the bird had to get off. So they offload my team as quick as we can. And we're just like wading through sticky taffy, trying just to get to the berm on the edge. And it was about as funny as anything I'd seen in combat, because it was just watching all these tough guys like, oh, there was bitch, God, it's shit. Oh my God, and all those uniforms had to get, we just burn them all when we finally got out. It was we had to spend like 2 days cleaning everything, all the optics, night vision, weapons. It was just like, weeks later, I'm finding little dried pieces of shit in my equipment.
Yeah, like, gotta get all up in the crevices, don't you?
Yeah, we basically bleached ourselves with a hose when we got back. But yeah, you can get. Hopefully, you don't encounter anything like that. But swamp landings you've got to have some good planning skills for that. It sounds very fun, to be honest.
Yeah, well, I'll keep you posted about that for sure. All right, well, Klint, we are actually starting to bump up against time, so I do want to get to the wrap up. I have a couple of standard things that I usually like to go over with my guests as we wrap up. One of them that is fairly new that I've been doing is I've been asking my guests to issue a challenge to the listeners, because we talk about like some pretty cool adventure aspects today. We talked a little bit about mindset today and a few other things, but of course, information being presented in a podcast can only take someone so far. They got to follow it up with action themselves afterwards. So I'd like to ask you, what challenge would you issue to the listeners for them to start living a more adventurous life?
Okay. I thought about this one, and I think challenge being not like, you should go run up a mountain every day, but go travel, and wherever you travel, be it local, be it, somewhere exotic, find something of intellectual curiosity to explore while you're there. Find something unique about that area. And it doesn't mean your trip needs to be a research trip if you're going to go to southern coast of Spain. But find something in the world, in what your interests and hobbies are, that you can take a bit of time and find something unique in that area and go explore that one little intellectual aspect of wherever you're traveling to. If you're going to go climb a mountain, go read about the geology of the mountain, find out what's unique. Oh, this has this sort of igneous rock there, and so it's unique to this area. See if you can find a sample, something that is unique to that area, that challenges you a bit intellectually and adds another layer of depth to your trip, other than I'm going to the Costa del Sol in southern Spain and they've got really good cheap wine. Now that's fantastic. But if you've got a hobby that involves, maybe you're really into wine, go visit one of the wineries or vineyards and see what's unique about the soil that makes that wine taste so good. Or in my case, I'm really interested in mushroom hunting, right? I'm interested in, it's kind of an offshoot of foraging, but now I'm more interested in just the mycology and fungal stuff. It was dorky again. But when I go to new places that don't have, like, let's say, a lot of geology exposed, I'll look up what's unique about the environment there, what type of mushrooms they have and what season. And if I get a chance, I'll break away, I'll go out to the forest and I'll challenge myself to find a unique species of mushroom that I've never seen before. And I'll take a photo and I'll write it down. And that's if I'm dealing with forests. If I'm going somewhere that's got a lot of cool geology, I will challenge myself to find an example of a type of mineral or rock that is unique to that area. And so it gives me something. I always bring back a little sample if it's legal to do so. I don't take things.
Yeah, check on that first.
I do check on that, but it always gives me a little bit of an interesting way to explore the landscape in the region that's beyond just the normal tourist attractions. And also it gives you another way to interact locally, because a lot of areas you go, if it's the geology or mushroom hunting or foraging, you may find someone local that's interested in these things as well. And they may give you some insight, but it's a really nice way to interact with locals. If you just, you can go to France. If you're visiting France, you can go to a pharmacy, and most of the pharmacists will speak English. And you can ask them, where is a good place to go find this type of mushroom? All the pharmacists in France are trained to identify the common edible and toxic mushrooms. So you can bring a basket of mushrooms that you've harvested into a pharmacy, and the pharmacist will sit there and sort them out and say, you shouldn't eat this, And so,
nice.
And I've done that before. And not only that, they find out you're a foreigner, you're interested in this. They will like send you to their neighbor's house and like, oh, you should go talk to old Pierre. He knows all the stuff. And you'll find yourself meeting new people and interacting with the landscape in ways you never imagined. And so that's my challenge. Find something interesting, unique to that area, either in the natural sciences or the architecture, and go explore it. Capture it either with a photo or a sample. Find something just a little bit different than the normal tourist sort of, I'm going to go look at a bunch of old buildings and then go drink wine and go swimming in the beach. Add that next layer of depth and complexity to your travels. And I think most people will find that their travels are suddenly way more interesting than they previously had experienced.
As you were just saying that, I was just thinking of my time in Edinburgh, Scotland. And, I saw like everyone heading to the main tourist hubs like Edinburgh Castle, which, not to take away from the castle because it's magnificent, but to me, it was just so crowded. And by the time I had made it to Edinburgh, I had just spent, 5 days slugging it out over land, in the Highlands. So I was kind of exhausted, didn't really want to interact with a crowd just yet. So while everyone was going that way, myself and my friend that I was with, we decided to go that way. And, we're going to then we found the small, little market where no tourists are hardly. And we go into this candy store. Now, it's a candy store. People won't think that's too exciting or impressive, but then we actually, I was curious and I asked the owner, the man that was there running the place. And, he's had the shop for a long time, and he makes his own candy out of iron brew. Did you ever have iron brew while you were there?
Oh, yeah. God. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And
Iron brew.
Exactly. So now for anyone who doesn't know what we're talking about, iron brew is this Scottish energy drink, just chock loaded with sugar. It's actually really tasty. I kind of like it. But this guy takes iron brew and he makes different forms of hard candy. And I just thought that was a really cool, amazing local cultural experience there that I never would have had I, like you said, just kind of stayed on the tourist route. I got off the beaten path a little bit, which for some, that's getting out of their comfort zone a little bit, because a lot of people want to gravitate towards maybe familiarity, or if someone says, hey, go check this out where you go there, they might gravitate towards that. But just stepping off the beaten path a little bit, just that was just a really cool experience that I had. And plus his Iron Brew hard candy was actually really good. So
Was it?
yeah. So I appreciate that response, because there is a lot of value when you do things like that when you travel, for sure.
Absolutely. And the phrase "get off the beaten path" sounds cliche, but if you find ways to do it, like going to the candy store, going where the crowd isn't. Now, sometimes that means that the other direction sucks or something.
Right.
There's a reason. But in some cases, it's not. And that's when I said find something. And maybe a better way to phrase that challenge is create a little mental or intellectual scavenger hunt anywhere you go. If it's architecture you're interested in and you're going to Scotland, find examples of 12th century Gothic architecture. Tell yourself you're going to find several examples and take photos, or candy stores, or a unique food thing, something, because as archaeologists, you've got a background in both geography, you're going to have some geology and archaeology and some environmental science, which is one of the great things about archaeology. You need to be a sort of jack of all trades.
Right.
You can't go anywhere without sort of noticing landscapes and the geology and reading wherever you go as a story to be told or a mystery to be solved or something to pique your interest. And like, if you're like me, especially when you go out with friends traveling, you end up becoming half tour guide. You're like, oh, look at that geological formation. That's really weird. That's igneous rock. That's just a sediment. What's going on? And they'd be like, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, there was some volcanic activity going on here or something, and they're like, oh, wow, that's cool. That gives us you get that ability to read the landscape and the cultural features. It makes traveling so much more interesting. And that's why I suggest make yourself a little scavenger hunt. Anywhere you go, find something cool, whatever interests you.
Yeah, absolutely. Right on. All right. So what I have next for you is what I call my final three. These are three, I like to think that they're fun questions that every guest gets asked at the end of the show. So you're going to get asked these as well. So here we are. And the first one of those is, what is your favorite place that you've been to so far?
Wow. You asked that one. It's still a hard one. I saw it. You'd given me heads up on that one. I still have a hard time answering that. I'll say, you know what? Southern Spain is one of the funnest place I've been to excavate. The food's great. The weather's awesome. People are friendly. It's really cheap. And so in terms of just, that's pleasant. That's one of my favorite places to go. It's like spring break for dorks when you go to Southern Spain to excavate, because you drink good beer and wine, and then you go dig, and then you eat good food, and everybody stays up till 1 a.m, because culturally speaking, and you take a nap in the middle of the day. But Mongolia has been the most sort of mind-blowingly interesting landscape I've ever been to in terms of work. Now, I would also say the area around Moab, Utah is one of my favorite places on the planet. And when I lived in Colorado, I would go there 5 or 6 times a year. That was my mental happy place. So
right.
Instead of an ice cave, I go to my mental happy place is just being out on the slick rock out by Moab with my mountain bike and a campsite nearby. That's a happy place.
Right on.
But Mongolia is a fantastically interesting place to go, and both culturally, geographically, terrain, and history. I love Mongolia.
I think that might be a first. I've had other guests in the podcast who have been to Mongolia, but I think this is the first time that it's been marked as a favorite. So there we go. We got a milestone for this episode.
There you go. All right.
All right. And the next question, what is one thing on your bucket list that you have yet to do?
I would really like to go climb mountains in Argentina. I have not had a chance to do that.
All in due time, I'm sure.
and eat good barbecue and drink good wine. All those things. So that's definitely a bucket list thing. That's on the near future, I hope.
Right on. Awesome. And the last question, and this is a two-parter. What is your favorite animal, and have you seen this animal in the wild?
Okay. Well, one, my favorite animal. Give me a sec. Come here, buddy. He's right here. But I assume you're talking. Ringo, come on up. Hey, come on. I assume you're talking about a sort of, hey, bud, come here. A wild animal or some sort of not. Oh, sorry. This is Ringo.
Hey, Ringo.
So, this is my favorite animal. But my other favorite animal would be when this comes back to Mongolia. When I was working in Mongolia, we stayed with a family who lived in a, I guess you call it a yurt, but
right.
And they had Bactrian camels, and those are about the coolest damn things I've ever seen. And it's when you look at a Bactrian camel, you're looking at like what a mad scientist would invent as the perfect logistical vehicle for a military operation in a remote environment. These things can go like 2 months without water. They can drink salt water. They eat pointed scrub that has 2-inch long thorns, and they have these big pillowy tongues that just absorb it and recycle. They can go for miles and miles without needing to rest. You can shave them, and they provide fiber to make clothing out of. You can burn their dung for fuel. You can drink their blood on the go, make a slit if you need food, or their milk, which is highly nutritious. And they require almost nothing. And logistically speaking, they're one of the most, it's hard to believe that they weren't created by a mad scientist. And the Bactrians are just cool. And I have seen them and worked with them enough to just be kind of blown away, because they check all my little boxes. Is it weird? Is it logistically interesting? Is it evolutionarily interesting? Is it something I could potentially use? Is it yes, 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 yes? And is it exotic? Is it, yeah, all these things.
That's another first to come up on the podcast yet again. I don't even think just like a regular camel has come up on the podcast yet, but like this type of breed of camels, that's pretty fascinating. I'm gonna have to take to Google once we're done with this conversation to look that up.
They're cool, and actually, there's an episode of the show, one of the shows I host for, called "What on Earth," where we're working in Mongolia. And there's a number of scenes with the Bactrian camels, and that was one of the funner experiences I've had in the television production world, because it was a very small film crew, 2 people and me and a local guide in a Jeep in the Gobi Desert, or a Toyota, and we didn't have a massive budget. We just kind of had to make. We didn't even really have a script or a storyboard for what the show episode we were filming. It was kind of done last minute, and the production company kind of handed a couple ideas off to me and the producer I was working with. They're like, I don't know, go make some interesting archaeology TV. And we're like, okay. So they flew us to Ulaanbaatar, and we get a Jeep, and it's middle of winter, and we just head out to the Gobi Desert. Now, the only thing we did have was this satellite image of what was probably a Bronze Age burial mound that didn't match the archaeology of any of the known cultures of that area. It was a very remote part of the Gobi Desert. And so we had to kind of build a story on the go and film all the footage and find all the relevant cultural details that we could drip feed for this episode. And then I had to present it, but at the same time, every time we're driving, I'd done a lit review before we went out. I downloaded like 30 journal articles, and we're coming up with the script on the go. We're like, all right, well, this area didn't have horses, so it couldn't be this. Well, what are we going to tell the audience? I don't know. I'll think of something. Just get me up here. And they're like, okay, camera guy gets ready. And then, oh yeah, this place didn't have horses, so it couldn't be this speculated whatever type of culture. It has to be this type of culture because there's nothing for horses to eat. Even horses couldn't, so you're making up stuff on the go. And as we're filming the last day, so we're going back to the airport the next morning, and the sun's setting, and we're just trying to get that last scene that wraps up the episode. And Mongolian border guards show up with AK-47, and then Chinese border guards, because we're right near the Chinese border. And we got all these guys with guns pointing at us, and the senior producer sitting there like, and I was like, just keep filming, dude. We don't have any daylight left. And meanwhile, it's 30 below zero, so the camera batteries are freezing up. And I had to build a little fire, and we're taking all the camera batteries and putting them around the fire, which is actually, so that's inverse. We built the fire. That's what drew the border guards. And we'd have a special permit to be filming here because we were so close to the Chinese border. But suddenly, me and a couple producers, and then these guys with AK-47s pointing at us, and one producer's just sitting there about to poop his pants and 30 below zero, and I'm like, just keep filming. And I was like, to the local guide, who happened to be the most famous DJ in Mongolia, and a production guide fixer,
really?
they call him, and occasional aide de camp to the president, this guy named Dandy. And Dandy's like, I'll take care of this. And it's like, great. And you keep filming. And so meanwhile, we're ignoring the AK-47s that are being pointed at us. And Dandy's up there like, oh, no, trying to, just so we can finish the scene, get that last shot done as the sun's setting. And fortunately, because he's the most famous DJ in Mongolia, they wanted his autograph. They didn't care who I was or the other guys. They're like, oh, Dandy. Oh, and they were like waving off the other guys like, oh, get out of here. We're on the Mongolian side. And so it kind of resolved itself. But it was a very interesting experience.
Never
both archaeologically and television-wise. Yeah, it was fun.
All right, awesome.
Not even sure I got onto that, but.
Well, kind of speaking of television and the work that you've done, as we wrap up here, I want to ask you, where our listeners can go connect with you. I know you're out there like on social media. You can be found there, and you have done, some production work. You've been on a couple of networks, the History Channel, Science Channel, and BBC. So what do you got out there? Where can the listeners find you?
So I've hosted for the last 3 seasons of What on Earth, a number of episodes as either the person on the ground investigating or the sort of expert in the studio. So I think it's like season 5, 6, and 7, What on Earth, Science Channel, and then another show called Mysteries of the Abandoned, which is also Science Channel. Abandoned Engineering, I think they call the same show when they market it in Europe. And then I don't even know if it's available in the US, but I hosted 2 seasons of this reality caveman survival, Stone Age survival show called 10,000 BC for UK Channel 5. And then, I've got a few children's books that I've co-authored on, one that I wrote for DK Books, one called The Stone Age. And that's one of the funnest things I've done, because I had to think through how to explain human evolution and Stone Age archaeology to a 10-year-old, but still be factually accurate. So it's a very complex set of concepts, but you got to make it relatable to a 10-year-old and the parent that might be reading it with them. So it needed to be entertaining for the parent. That was
right.
One of the funnest or most engaging things I've done. And then I'm also on regular social media. So Klint Janulis, survival scientist on Facebook, Janulis.Klint Instagram. I think Klint Janulis Twitter. I'm not really good with social media just because I'm so busy with the PhD. But beyond that, we are running a field school this summer in Wyoming near Yellowstone National Park. And it's an experimental archaeology field school. It's going to be a partnership with the University of Oxford and University of Colorado Springs, where students are going to come and live right at the base of the Shoshone mountain range. And they're going to learn Paleolithic technology and skills, how to apply those skills in a real setting, and then how to do a site survey and analysis, both on actual prehistoric sites that are in the area, and then on their own sites that they will be making as they're learning these skills. And then the last week, we're going to get together, everybody's going to design and implement their own experimental archaeology project. All the while, middle of summer, you're right outside Yellowstone, Montana, or Yellowstone, Wyoming. So that's going to be, I will give you the link for that.
Yeah, please.
When it goes up. So we're going to have a limited number of seats. This is the first type of this program, a very multiple discipline experimental archaeology field school that at the end of the day will be really informative, but also it should just be a ton of fun. And we're going to have students from Europe and the US. And so I'm looking forward to it. It'll be part of my academic career moving forward, is running courses like this to teach people how to look at the past by doing and experiencing some of what those people in prehistory would have experienced.
All right, outstanding. And I will please do send me that link. I'll get that in the show notes, as well as links to your social media accounts. And I'm pretty sure Science Channel probably has like a website where they can learn more about what on Earth and things like that. I'll get that linked up too, and to the book. Actually, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say the easiest way probably just to go to IMDb, just type in my name. So most of the episodes that I've hosted are on my IMDb page. So, and it'll link to Amazon or whatever streaming service has those shows. So.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Will do. All right. Well, hey, Klint, I want to thank you very much for taking the time for joining me today. I know we had to go a little bit back and forth, especially with, us having the time change, with me being in Florida and you being all the way in the UK. And yeah, man, I just, appreciate you. I mean, you got a great story, and I, admire your work in archaeology, and I certainly value our friendship. So thanks a lot for taking the time for being here and sharing your story with myself and the listeners today. Man, this has been great.
My pleasure, Josh. I'm really looking forward to your pictures. I want to hear all about your aerial survey and how that goes. And then with your dual trek, please keep me in the loop on that. I want to support it, because I really think that what you're supporting is a great cause, because I think it could really help a lot of veterans find a way to channel whatever it is they need to channel, whether it's something, whether they just need meaningful work or they've got issues they're dealing with coming out of the military. Archaeology is a great way to handle both. And I think it's a really great cause. I'm very happy to support you. So please keep me in the loop on that. I'm happy to repost it and get other people engaged with it.
Right
I think it's a great idea, and good luck with it.
All right. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. So, all right, Klint, let's wrap this up. Thanks again for joining me, man. It's been awesome.
Take care, guys.